Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webcast from the conference board. We're delighted you could join us today for a very, very important topic around kind of corporate governance and long-term value. We're seeing with COVID some extraordinary times at the present time, but even before COVID, we had arguably one of the biggest changes taking place in business, both in terms of what's going on in terms of digital, but also in terms of purpose as well. And it's possible that we may see more change in corporate governance in the coming decade than we have in the last 100 years. And it's today what we want to do is look at that change that may be happening and try and understand it. So we're delighted that you can join us today at the conference board in order to try and understand these issues. Our webcast series is focused on corporate governance and how it develops. In particular, how can we enhance performance, but also deliver on purpose? And we've got 3 webcasts coming up over the autumn period. We're looking at the digital board in November, ethics, stakeholders in the financial sector in October. But today, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Greg Medcraft from the OECD in terms of looking at the policy issues that surround this change in terms of corporate governance and long-term value. So I'm delighted that you can join us today, Greg. Maybe you could just briefly introduce yourself to our guest today.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My background, as you may have read, currently I'm Director of the OECD, responsible for financial enterprise affairs, which really is focused on one part is conduct, which includes our divisions of responsible business conduct, anti-corruption, and corporate governance. And on the other side, our markets cluster of insurance, pensions, financial markets, and competition and international investment. But prior to that, for nearly a decade, I was Commissioner, but also for a very lengthy period, the Chairman of the Australian Securities Investments Commission, and for a period of about 3 or 4 years, the Chairman of the IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions. And then prior to that, I was nearly 30 years an investment banker, including Wall Street. So I've seen both sides, and it's an interesting discussion that we're actually having today. So there are not many upsides to COVID-19 pandemic, but one of them, I think, is the growth of virtual conversations like this. This one, can be accessed from anywhere in the world. We can see such a wide range of geographies represented among the participants online. And another effect of the pandemic is that it's really sharpened questions around the role of the corporation. Incredibly, as a former corporate regulator, it's amazing the change in that discussion and their role in meeting, I think, the shared economic and social challenges. And I think it has underlined the importance of resilience at the company, national and global level. So what I'm going to do is kick off our discussion with a presentation focusing on 3 areas. First of all, the tension that's in the governance models where I'll expand and perhaps some observations on stakeholder capitalism. Secondly, talk about the drivers for long-term value in this context, focusing particularly on the trust in business and ESG risk outcomes in particular. And then thirdly, what I consider to be the priorities for long-term value creation for the chair and the board, but also for policymakers as well. So if we go to the slides,
Greg, could we just do a couple of housekeeping?
Sure.
Just before we start that, thank you for that introduction. Really, really appreciated and delighted you can be with us here.
Thank you.
Just a couple of points to be made for our webcast and to really kind of help everybody get the most out of the webcast. So the first is, in terms of asking questions, you can see we've got a chat box down the bottom, so please do pass your questions on both while I'm speaking and in particular while Greg's speaking. We want to make it as interactive as possible. It is possible to download the presentation, so we're quite happy for you to do that and welcome it. Share it with your colleagues. As Greg said in the introduction, this is particularly kind of big issue that's come even more to the fore, unfortunately, with COVID. And you can view in full screen. So if you want to look at just the slides, or Greg and I, you can choose in terms of what that is. And please do share this with colleagues. As I said, it is available online after we've finished the live presentation today. Just in terms of if you're looking at earning credits in terms of development, so CPE and CPD, if you are doing that, just two different ways. One is the CEU, you need to request in order to get the CPE bit, and that's at the bottom right of the webcast, and you can get an email address from the CPD as well. So if it's CEU, then click on the link. If it's the other one on the, look at the credit from the emails to get the credit there. It's important to stay online for the entire webcast, and we'll get some pop-ups coming up so you can do that. And final point is that the credit is available for participation in the live webcast only. So just a few housekeeping matters. Just before you start, Greg, I was just going to kind of...
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. Yeah.
Just a couple of thoughts that we have at kind of conference board in terms of thinking about this. As I was saying in the beginning that I think you mentioned this as well, that we have a very, very kind of complex corporate governance landscape, but really that's been brought into focus with COVID. And our purpose really today is not to look at the differences in corporate governance, but rather what we've got in terms of similarities and what needs to be done really to really kind of engage with these changes and basically wrap your arms around them in order to kind of be successful in the future. So we have very, very different corporate governance, both within Europe, where principally we're looking at here, but even when we look at other major economies, obviously the US, where it's typical to have the CEO and the president stroke chairman in the same individual. But as I said, our focus here is really to kind of look at the differences rather than look at the similarities rather than the differences. One of the drivers behind this is, that listed companies are really finding it more and more challenging at the present time. If we look at the tenure of the S&P 500, in 1970, some 50 years ago, the average company was around for 45 years. And it's estimated within 5 years, by 2025, that the average company will be on that index for only 15 years. So the forces of change are huge, and survival is even more difficult now. And corporate governance will be absolutely pivotal in that success or failure in the future. We think that the chair is particularly important in terms of looking at that. And we want to kind of drill down into specifically, maybe what the chair can do in terms of the wider kind of corporate governance issues. Now, I don't think anybody would disagree with the forces that we've mapped out here on this particular slide in terms of decline in trust that we've seen, for example, in the Edelman register, in terms of climate change. We're all very aware of that. Social convulsions, what we've seen around Black Lives Matters in recent months. Digital disruption, which is most of the stock market gains we've seen during COVID have been within the digital giants in the FANGs. And we've got kind of regulatory issues as well. Above on all of that, we've got COVID. But the point I think I want to make really here is that we have effectively the kind of metrics of paradox, I might call it, if that's understandable. On the one hand, we are increasingly talking about purpose and long-term value. At the same time, and somewhat paradoxically, quarterly earnings haven't gone away. In fact, the need to kind of produce the numbers on a quarterly basis is as intense and arguably even more intense than ever. So how do corporate governance and the chair deal with those very paradoxical kind of driving forces? And I think that, Greg, you're going to talk about this. This is kind of a view that we have, which is, you can see with the green and red arrows here on each one of those parts of kind of long-term value creation, investors, stakeholders, and executive management, there are paradoxical forces pulling on each of those in different ways. And really, is it the chair, I suppose, what we want to kind of consider in a way that may be at the heart of somebody who can actually kind of sit all three of those and guide the organization to successful future. I think Paul Polman put it one way, which is basically that the costs of inactivity outweigh those of taking action. So it's really not a kind of question of not doing this. And my final point before I hand over to you, Greg, was really around just in terms of, so what would we add to the chair? What's missing at the present time about how do we do that? I think sharing the narrative and the load with the CEO is absolutely pivotal, but maybe there needs to be a clearer kind of distinction between the short term of that paradox about delivering operationally and financially with the CEO, and the chair is very much the eye on the long-term value creation as maybe one way of doing that. And 4 areas that the chair may look at, just as a kind of starter, would be sustainability and purpose around the things that need to happen there in the long term, and also in terms of the long-term value management, which we're going to focus on today. But I think also culture and resilience, you mentioned, Greg, in your opening, are absolutely kind of critical, I think, in terms of actually providing somewhat is the intangible factors of corporate governance, which are often missed in the need to look at metrics. So I think in terms of, corporate governance doesn't get headlines for the right reasons. It's only when things go wrong, whether it's a wire card or something like this, where we see the headlines being there. But actually, corporate governance is actually the source of future success, and we don't see that part of it. But that's what we want to look at today and really kind of try and dive in and look at, really in terms from a policy point of view, how that might happen. So, Greg, just a little bit of a kind of context and some of our own thoughts there. I don't know if you agree with them or disagree with them. But
I actually agree with them all, actually, and especially I think one of the big things I focused on when I was chairman of ASIC was culture, and which is clearly so important, and it starts at the top. But equally, the issue of communicating, as chair, I completely agree with, and also the issue of purpose and sustainability. And often I used to emphasize that, the values and the most important decision that a board ever makes or a chair makes is who they appoint as the CEO, and making sure that that person's values align with the values of the board. Because if they don't, you've got a problem from day one. So I think it does align with my experience, because often where we saw problems occur in conduct were generally where there was essentially that alignment wasn't occurring. So yes, I agree very much with the 4 items you've got up there, very much from experience, actually. But also in my presentation, if we move along to the 3rd slide of this presentation, I've mentioned the outline, but I think it sort of reflects a little bit of what was on your slide as well, as you said. I mean, we've been a lot of talk about stakeholder capitalism, and I will say, I remember having this debate 10 years ago about primacy of shareholders, and I always view as the long term they'll all have to be aligned, otherwise you're going to have a problem as a company. So this is a debate I've seen over a long time. You probably have as well. So we've had this talk about stakeholder capitalism. We've had the Business Roundtable statement August last year that sought to redefine the purpose of the corporation towards a stakeholder-centric model, and this was actually echoed with the World Economic Forum's new Davos Manifesto in January. And the statements contained some promising commitments, but as we know, boards do have a legal obligation to the interests of their shareholders first and foremost, and that means that there is this inherent tension sometimes to stakeholder models. So, as I said, what happens when stakeholder interests and shareholder interests do not align, or when stakeholder interests, even amongst themselves, and we often have to deal with that they are in fact themselves are in conflict, because we know stakeholders are not a monolith. They can have different things that they may be concerned about. So this diagram is really just simply a simplification of quite a much more complex problem. But I think resolving this tension means that what you've got to do is try to expand the area of overlapping interests in the middle of the chart, right? That's, and the way to do that is within the current legal and regulatory regimes, I think, is to pursue a stronger focus on long-term value creation. As Chris just noted, it's maybe perhaps easier said than done. And I probably want to use the next part of the presentation to perhaps explore the two interrelated components of long-term value, and that I see as critical, I think, to growing that area in the middle where interests do align and providing boards with the incentive and the legal basis for pursuing value for shareholders that also deliver for stakeholders. I think the first thing on that is building value through trust, and I think means meeting the social license to operate and managing the related reputational risk. I think that's really important. A little bit to your comment, Chris, is managing long-term sustainability risks, which often now referred to commonly as environmental, social, and governance risks, or ESG risks, is really important for that sustainability question that you've mentioned. Now, if I move on to slide 4, I want to start emphasizing that the importance of trust in business as a driver of resilience at the macroeconomic level, but also as a driver of long-term value at the company level. At the macro level, trust in business is important for two reasons we know, because business is at the core of wealth and well-being in our economies. Normal times, growth is endangered if trust in business is low, and in times of crisis, recovery can be stymied. And secondly, because companies make an important part of the fabric of our society. Business can and should be the source of confidence and trust in the community at a time when those things are needed most. And actually, you all probably know the Edelman survey. At the moment, it's actually showing the trust in business is higher than government. So, business is trusted, but then maybe in government it's a low bar. So at the company level, I think there is a strong body of evidence that actually shows that trust is an important part of long-term business success. And I think this slide has an excerpt from an empirical study by the OECD that shows that a business's capacity to generate trust and loyalty in its workforce, in its customers, and society at large is an overwhelming predictor of long-term returns on equity and return on assets. So trust actually is it's just good for business. And I used to say this in my previous role, it's simply good for business. And it really comes down to the social license to operate. And I must say, we all know this is a relatively new term that we're using, but I do think it does encompass a very important concept. And that is, the expectations from stakeholders, including customers, employees, investors, and the wider community. And if a company, as we all know, if your conduct doesn't meet expectations, and expectations are changing constantly, you run the risk of reputational damage. And we all know that today reputational risk is ranked often the #1 risk for companies, and has been for a few years. And again, we know that then affects the ability to attract and retain clients and staff and capital. So they're all related. It comes down to trust, and that measurement of trust is not static. It's constantly moving, and what you've got to do to keep it. And again, we know today the scrutiny of the 24-hour news cycle and social media. Anyone can communicate, whether for right or wrong, with a huge amount of people. And so stakeholders today, they have more power to hold companies to account against the social license and mobilize when companies fall short. In fact, I used to say as a regulator, if you're not worried about me, you should be worried about the social media, because they will really hurt and hold you to account. So I think we are in a new world. If we go to the next slide, COVID-19, does present challenges and opportunities when it comes to the social license. Stakeholders' expectations have never been higher than ever before for two main reasons. First is that businesses are rightly seen as important in fighting the pandemic and its economic impact, such as the direct response to the pandemic itself. For example, the development of vaccines, retooling manufacturing for medical supplies, supporting remote working, or ensuring safety in working spaces. And secondly, it's a response to the wider impacts, such as delivery of payroll-based income support through payrolls in some countries like UK and Australia. So, the community is seeing business getting a lot of support. So second, I think the social expectations attached to, as I say, that government support already have been quite substantial. So many businesses are relying on governments during this time, and that is they're relying on taxpayers. And that, as I say, that comes with certain expectations from the wider society. And the community will want to see businesses that are receiving support, that they're actually doing what they can to contribute to fighting the pandemic, but also supporting employees and the communities. So, and I think the cost of not meeting those expectations, can be enormous to businesses and the entire sectors. For example, if we look at the reputational damage to banks after receiving bailouts in the last financial crisis, it was considerable. So that we saw, that many of the banks got assistance, but then we saw the massive conduct issues that emerged after the crisis. So, and in some countries, they're deeply unpopular, and the electorate has allowed new taxes to be levied on the financial sector. For example, the bank levy in the UK has raised £2.3 billion since 2011. So, and again, even in my own country of Australia, the banks have sort of suffered and probably continue to suffer because the community is concerned about whether they're really meeting their the social license. So I think it's a whole new world today, and it's very hard, I think, for a board. If we go,
let's ask a question on that.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. I just wondered, your vast experience of, obviously in current role in OECD, but also as regulator, in terms of corporate governance and that much more kind of, let's call it fluid situation, both in terms of news and reputation. And this is just a compliance issue, as you said, in terms of the regulators. I wondered if you'd seen any organizations that had managed to wrap their arms around this a little bit, both in terms of actually being more responsive and proactive in terms of what they do, but also actually maybe adding individuals to the board who've got experience in dealing with this, news cycle and much more volatile media and political cycle that seems to be going on now.
Yes, well, it's in terms of I can't really name specific corporations, but I think that I've seen good practices with companies, because obviously as the chairman of the regulator, I used to spend a lot of time meeting with major company boards and discussing, this issue of, in particular, the issue of culture, because the boards, boards are often they don't see this thing coming. They don't see the scandal that's coming. It's tough for boards. So, what I've seen as sort of the best practice is, often, many boards now have sort of cultural indicator dashboards to get an idea of, customer complaints, why it's the feedback from staff that are leaving. It's that thing of getting the vibe of what's going on in the company. Yes. Some of them doing, they do external stakeholder surveys to get an idea of what, people think of the company. So I think you've got to think about tools. What I've seen as best practice is really having tools that the board, can engage on. What are the various stakeholders actually thinking of the company that perhaps can call out perhaps an issue that could blow up. And often where we saw problems was where they really were blindsided by problems that are occurring. And also, my experience is, the communication, flowing up from senior management, is quite important. So, making sure that you don't just have the CEO, that you actually have other members of the management team that are there at the board, and that it's not, you're just not seeing the view coming through the CEO is quite important. But equally, as you said, one of the things of actually having a diversity of skills, and you're seeing a lot of boards now obviously adding, people, board members that have very good social media knowledge, skills, etc. But also equally the issue of just simply compliance. And but I must say my view of a good board is one that is challenging and collegial. One that is willing, as a board. And one of the things I always say to board members is, if you don't like what's happening, sometimes the best option is to resign. Don't necessarily, if you're not happy, because often we'd have problems, and the board member would say, well, I wasn't happy, I didn't like what's happening, but I thought I'd stay in there and try and change. But I think at times you can send a signal, and that signal very harsh, but you can send a signal. So they're just some of the things. But I do think the number one is what you had there is, focus on your culture and your values. I know we keep saying that, but it is so true. And generally, when you meet a board, you get a pretty good idea pretty quickly whether they're really aware of the culture versus the senior management. So just to touch on a little bit to answer your question.
I think this is a hugely valuable message in terms of actually that, I'm sure we're going to move now into kind of looking at ESG and risk management and, in a sense, practices. But if you don't build that on a culture that's very robust, then you can put in place the best practices, my guess is, and actually it's built on a foundation of sand, and you're not actually going to achieve what you need to achieve. So would that be a fair summary?
And good culture beats a good strategy any day. If you don't get the culture right, forget about everything else. Get it right and make sure that it's implemented through the organization with the appropriate system of internal control. But as I said, the most important thing is who you select as your CEO is so important, actually, because if that doesn't align, you have a problem from day one.
So just one other final question before we move on would be around this area, which is that you cited a kind of nuclear option, if you like, which is basically if you're not happy with it as a non-exec, that you've always got the ultimate, which is to quit the board. Arguably, maybe before that, are there things where that non-exec should be requesting that there's transparency around some of the issues that you mentioned, maybe pulse surveys with the employees? What's customer satisfaction like with people? As a board, are we seeing those kind of things? Because if those kind of things, we don't have transparency, it suggests the culture's not right, i.e. basically we don't have the transparency.
That's correct.
And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So would you say advocate that as a first step before going?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and also make sure it's in the minutes. But I think that's the first step is, I think engage, propose, document, but if all fails, then, you've really got to take your own decision, actually, because I know from experience as a regulator, we didn't have much sympathy for directors who sort of said, well, we were not happy, we were uncomfortable. And the tough one is for board directors is whether if it's something serious, a cultural problem, at what point do you then approach, the regulator to say, I've got some real concerns, and that's a tough one, actually. So, yes, that's it. But at some stage, I think the thing is, first of all, the best thing sometimes is is that market signal is important, but I think you take a measured approach.
Sorry, one final question around this area which is that, in a sense, it's the chair who cultivates that culture for the board. And again, not asking for specific examples, but just in general, based on your experience, seeing where good chairs cultivated that culture. It's not something that happens overnight and you can flick a switch and that is the culture issue dealt with when you put a tick in the box. Is actually something where it's much more around literally cultivating like a garden or something like
Yeah.
this, which you
Yeah.
constantly have to do in order to get that. Again, are there kind of areas or practices or where you've seen chairs really kind of developing that on a longer term basis, and maybe how do they do that?
Well, really, what I've seen, the good chairs tend to, um, they tend to, the good chairs. What I've seen is they do tend to spend a lot of time with the CEO to understand. They're quite generally the good chairs I've found have been quite hands-on as a leader. But as we know, but a trust. I think you've got to be a trusted partner with the CEO, or that's the first step in making sure that the CEO knows that they can trust the chair and that partnership works, and the chair can feel comfortable. But I think the second one is I think making sure that the chair does get involved with audit committee or key stays across some of those key committees is quite important. But equally, to your point before, I think communication by the chair at appropriate times is quite important. And the other thing about a good chair, it's actually building a good team, because the board is a team. So it's about actually having a team, having a diversity of skills on that team, and having respect and trust and transparency, being willing to be challenged in a collegial setting. I think that's important, so that you do work as a team, and you push the whole thing. To me, they're the sort of what some of the best chairs I know actually are fairly quiet and don't say a lot, but there's enormous respect for them, but they do spend a lot of time building that trust and collegiality, and they're willing to be challenged if need be. So that's just my own experience.
Yeah. No,
But I think it's like anything. It's about building a trusted team, and if that team is trusted, then often the market will actually know that this company is actually, board is good, they trust, they have good meetings, and I've seen companies really go from sort of some very large, well-known ones go from quite a dysfunctional board to the new chair comes in, and it's been an incredible difference building that team. So hopefully that gives you some guidance.
Yeah. So culture and resilience absolutely critical in terms of building that.
And communication. Yeah.
Good. Good. So
yeah, you've got all the homework right.
So far, great.
Yeah. So, but if I now turn to the management of non-financial stability risks, and again back to the board nowadays, having people that understand these areas is extremely obviously important. So this is where I think the corporate sector has coalesced around, if you want, this catch-all phrase of environmental, social and governance risk factors. And all major jurisdictions require a comprehensive and robust approach to risk in their corporate governance regimes. I think there's rapidly a growing acknowledgement that it's been, again, accelerated by the pandemic, especially business continuity planning. So disaster recovery, which means, again, ESG risks can be material, and that is they could have a meaningful impact on your finances, your operations, or your reputation, or actually viewed by shareholders as very important in making investment or voting decisions. And we've seen some recent issues that have occurred, even like the Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, etc. Good examples of this whole emergent. And as such, ESG really does form part of a board's, or should form part of a board's risk management responsibilities in execution of their fiduciary duty. I mean, it's a risk framework, to manage it. So I don't think it's just a framework. So, but I do think managing ESG risks actually not fundamentally different from managing any other risks a company may face. But I think there are two things to note. I think first is that ESG risks impact not just the company itself, but various stakeholders outside of the company, and hence ESG factors often can sit in that overlapping space, as we mentioned, between shareholder and stakeholder interest. That's a key aspect we know of this. And then secondly, explicit management of ESG risks are becoming more commonplace at the board level, but it's far from a mature practice. So it does mean boards are likely to need new types of data, information channels, analytical tools, expertise, and internal policies and practices that are specifically tailored to assessing ESG risks. And I'll return to some of these challenges in a moment, but I want to seize on one element where I think OECD has been doing a lot of work in this area, and that's on ESG data, because as we know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So that goes to the heart of the OECD. So our upcoming report on ESG investing practices, progress and challenges, which should be released in the next few weeks, actually takes stock of some of the recent developments in ESG markets. In particular, it looks at existing practices, it looks at materiality of ESG disclosure, it looks at the usefulness of ESG ratings and the performance of ESG investments. And while we don't have time to delve into that data today, what we've found that a lot of good progress has been made in these markets of measuring ESG outcomes and articulating their impact on materiality, but there's still some very serious challenges remain, including, first of all, the relevance and consistency of ESG disclosure and reporting frameworks. Makes it very hard to assess and benchmark performance between companies and industries. It's a very fragmented area, actually. Secondly, you know, as a saying, I think in the in the land of the blind, one-eyed man is king. Well, I think ESG is a good example of it. You know, the second thing is the level of opacity in ESG scoring from rating advisors, providers, includes many subjective elements within a score. So the ESG scores are actually not really comparable. They have lots of subjectivity in them. So again, this is another area we're raising. And then, you know, there's considerable variations between ESG performance and financial performance, which is driven by a wide range of ESG assessment methodologies and ESG metrics in the market. So it makes the link with materiality very different to measure. So that real lack of comparable and readily available data that makes it difficult for fiduciaries to measure and manage ESG risk and ESG performance is quite a big problem, and I'm sure many on this call know exactly what I'm talking about. So, but importantly, it also makes it difficult for the board to communicate clearly to shareholders the materiality of ESG risks and to justify that against current legal frameworks for ESG related actions, or even if, you know, shareholders believe you should have addressed that issue because it's material. So it really is quite a big concern. So, and it is a critical issue if we're talking about the role of the chair, both as a sustainability ambassador and, if you want, a long-term value captain. So it does come back to the topic at hand, as you know, the chair as a leader. So as I said in the previous slide, building trust in business and managing ESG risks are obviously very related in three ways. First is that reputational damage is one way poor ESG performance can become material. Secondly, ESG risk management can be a particularly useful tool to help monitor and meet the social license. I think it's really important. You've got to have some way of at least have a framework. And then thirdly, comparable data, and this is really a big problem, on ESG performance, you know, really could empower market participants like customers and investors to direct their money towards companies that do align to their social values and expectations, and perhaps away from companies that do not. So, you know, this is a big area of problem. I'll just, if you want, do we have any more questions, Chris? Will I continue?
Just one on the when we were just talking about ESG there, and actually that we have in the marketplace a range of providers providing arguably non-comparable outputs, which can be somewhat confusing for investors, difficult for the board and the executive management team to manage because they're dealing with different things from different organizations. Is it a priority in your personal view?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think you know, what we currently have today, I think, is something like, I don't know, 35 or 40 trillion of ESG referenced investments around the world, and growing. We know the trend is growing. So a lot of money is going into ESG referenced investments. So I think it's important that if investors are taking decisions, or if you want the other stakeholders, that in fact, if you're having a debate about how you're performing, if the data is actually not comparable, then if it's apples and oranges, then you're really having quite an inconsistent argument. So I do think it's a pretty critical thing, and I think what we need is, we need some sort of at least global data taxonomy. And even, I think that it really ultimately, if you think about it, many people say, look, at least if you had disclosed on a website, maybe say 30 key indicators of E, S, and G that were all the same. A bit like, again, accounting standards where, that the data you're arguing about, whether it's the sizing of your trade debtors, that everyone's measured at the same, then, although I must say we don't necessarily have global accounting standards yet, but that's still a work in progress. But, I do think
Just on that point, I mean, people will see from both our biographies that we've been with big four firms in disguises over our career, and as you mentioned, there are accounting standards which aren't global accounting standards, but are comparable enough in order to give investors a degree of certainty about what's going on and the way to trust the numbers in the same way that the big four have come to basically kind of represent how that's done. Some people would say not as well as it could be, but regardless of that. And I've mentioned to some of my old colleagues, for example, at Deloitte, that basically, this is an area maybe that they or the accounting standards come in and try and recreate something that allows that comparability to happen. And arguably, it's a commercial opportunity for them as well, because it needs to happen. As you said, there are 30 to 40 trillion in ESG, and it's only going to grow. So, how do we create that? Maybe comes from other stakeholders in the future. I don't know if you would agree with that or anything.
Yeah, look, we've been engaging with the International Accounting Standards Board and the Research Foundation, and they are, as you probably know, looking at this issue. So I think that is where it needs to be looked at. And from the policy perspective, at OECD, we're going to release our banking and finance outlook at the end of the month, and it's focused on this area of ESG and resilient and sustainable finance. And one of the policy calls we are going to be calling for is really development of a global data standard for ESG measurement, a minimum. And I think I don't think it needs to be in the financial statements. It can be just, it can be on a website or whatever, where the data, you can access the data, whatever. So I do think this is where we've got to end up, frankly. And you're right, it is really like the accounting standard setters, and we hope that they take up this initiative, actually.
I have seen some companies now that major companies as well, that are now on their quarterly results actually having a joint presentation from both the CFO and the head of ESG.
Which is probably the trend of the future, I expect.
So can really come together and maybe provide some kind of comparability. And just a point, the report you mentioned that you release later this month is at the end of the pack, and there's a link there for anybody who's watching to download that. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have a link, I think, to the launch of the report, and the report will be available from there. That's correct. And we do go into this area in terms of looking at how ESG is used in terms of institutional investors, debt equity markets, and infrastructure. So it is broad reaching in terms of how we look at, the whole ESG issue. Okay. So, as I say, this probably is a nice segue into the last section of this presentation, which is really looking at priorities around building trust and managing ESG risks for boards towards long-term value creation, and for policymakers as well. And again, after all, OECD is a public policy body that's made up of member governments. I think, first of all, on building trust, I think we've got to remember that the shareholder value model rose to prominence in our regulatory systems about 50 years ago in an era of weak corporate governance and oversight. And today, I think we've got clear rules and guidance which clearly communicate market supervisors' expectations on corporate governance. But as I said before, social license to operate, which is really the next big leap, I think, in corporate accountability. As I said before, it's highly dynamic. It's a harder one because it's constantly moving. It's evolving much faster than legislation or regulation. But unfortunately, that legislation could catch up very quickly and you'd be caught short, as we all know. So I think there's three key things, and again, I would go back on my previous role as a regulator, that actions that boards, need to keep on top of. I think first of all is complementing legal obligations with a defined social license to operate. That is, you've got to monitor that and take steps to meet that social license. And whether you like it or not, the view of the crowd, as we know, impacts perhaps what legislators are going to be thinking about next. So my advice is keep an eye on what the crowd is thinking, and I'm sure that's sort of common practice now today with boards. The second is really focus on culture. And here the idea of the chair as a culture champion is completely spot on. In almost every instance of corporate conduct scandals, we see a disconnect between the stated values of a company and the actions of its staff. And just repeat that. We see that misalignment. And corporate governance does drive corporate culture, and it is the single most important factor in a company's ability to do the right thing. And as I said before, leadership from the chair and the board are critical. The tone from the top, I can't emphasize, I know it's a common saying, but it's so important. It matters so much, it's critical. The third thing is the gap between best practice and what actually happens. We know what good looks like when it comes to corporate governance and building a culture of trust, but there is actually a persistent implementation gap. And, a little bit, to help boards, it's why we established the Trusted Business Initiative, because the standards that we have, if you want the policy standards, are standards for actually policymakers to actually have to guide them on business conduct. So we actually said, well, you don't have to wait for the government to do it. You can use those standards, so they're public. So the OECD holds some of the world's premier standards and guidance on business conduct for policymakers. We have the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance, which I think are pretty well recognized. We have the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and Related Guidance, which is about managing ESG risks through company supply chains, including robust engagement and stakeholders. And we know that this is one of those risks that can really jump out and hurt you these days if you're not monitoring what's going on in your supply chains. And we've seen many cases of that which have come back to haunt companies. Thirdly, we've got the OECD Convention on Combating Foreign Bribery of Public Officials, which is a legally binding standard to criminalise foreign bribery in international business transactions. And this is a very, again, our work there in foreign bribery or in responsible business conduct in supply chains is increasingly being embraced by governments around the world following these. So, as I said, while they're primarily tools for governments in setting business policy environment and communicating expectations of business, they're equally valuable resources for companies to look to building trust. And as I said, what we want to do is drive better implementation of those standards. And as I said, it is the focus of our Trusted Business Initiative, which is actually a coalition of companies and NGOs. It does include Edelman and public agencies who have joined us to support the OECD Trusted Business Network. And anyone's interested, we can provide more details on that, Chris. If I now think about the challenges, the final part, I mentioned ESG risk management at both the company and the market level. I think at the company level, from a board perspective, I think, looking at this area of ESG risk management, I think the priority should be firstly tailoring the company's risk management to its particular sustainability circumstances and specific ESG risks, and that includes consideration of the board structure, a little bit to what you were saying, Chris, the composition, the procedures accommodating consideration of ESG risks, including the use of a risk committee if appropriate, or some companies have been establishing dedicated ESG sustainability committees. Obviously, we're seeing that. I think secondly, again, board capacity and understanding of ESG risks and associated standards and frameworks. Back to your comment about where you see things not happening. The director can actually say, but why don't we adopt this particular standard in supply chains? The due diligence, the auditing, why don't we do that, for example? And tools. So an interaction with management on the subject matter and experts inside and outside the company is part of that. Board capacity building is always really important, and that what we said, making sure you get diversity to start with is important. Thirdly, is I think establishing reporting and disclosure frameworks in line with relevant best practice, and that can be voluntary or part of reporting mandates, such as the EU's principles-based non-financial reporting directive, using the frameworks that I've mentioned, such as the OECD due diligence guidelines or the GRI support reporting, sustainability reporting standards, or even the UN United Nations Compact. So there are standards, and often it's really up to the company to select from the many reporting tools and metrics available. And I think it's here that really the chair's role as communicator-in-chief is important, to communicate the rationale for how the selection is consistent with the company's approach to ESG risks and the value proposition, the business model, and the socialising. They're the leader, and that tone from the top is where it comes. So I think while this is all clear, the actions of the chair and the board that they can take, the challenges I mentioned around ESG data and ESG reporting disclosure frameworks are not going to necessarily be solved at a company level. But I think the thing is to do what you can, to actually make it easier for those. I think if we just go to the next one, I think there is a clear need for policy makers to take action, and that's exactly, as I said, what the OECD is doing right now. Through our Sustainable and Resilient Finance Initiative, we're looking to identify the gaps in ESG markets, develop evidence-based policy solutions, and bring governments, business and stakeholders together to globally drive better outcomes and efficiency in this ESG area, which is really growing very fast. So we're actually focused on 5 priorities here. First of all, we want to forge agreement on a common taxonomy and definitions, at least a minimum taxonomy of data that all should be disclosing. Secondly, we want to build consensus around appropriate metrics in disclosure and ratings, so that we can have confidence and we can compare. It's important. We don't want to have arbitrage going on. Thirdly, lifting the transparency of rating methodologies. They shouldn't be black boxes. Fourthly, is aligning international practice and guidance to standardize data and disclosure and drive greater comparability. And then finally, data analysis towards better understanding the link between ESG, materiality, and performance. And as I said, this is the focus of our annual flagship publication, be it the Banking and Finance Outlook, which will be released 29th of September. And it does delve much more deeply into many of the issues that I've touched on today, both on the role of the board, but also on ESG markets more broadly. With that, I'll conclude the presentation. Links to many of the resources I mentioned are on this slide, and look forward to hearing any of your questions and comments. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, thank you, Greg. That's absolutely fantastic in terms of covering huge amount of ground on such a big issue, but also peppering it with lots of examples from particularly from your past of being a regulator, in terms of actually understanding what's going on with the board. We've just got 5 minutes before we close here. Just a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind taking one or two. Let me just have a look. So there's one here which is basically, if a board is to sincerely have a long-term perspective, do stakeholder and shareholder interests overlap more than indicated? In terms of the diagram you had and where they are, in that arguably the argument that basically that there's even more common interest, I think the question is actually asking. I don't know if you've got a view on that, Greg?
Well, I think in the long term, as I said earlier, they should almost be the same, right? So, but in the short term, they may not be the same. Okay, so for example, you underpay your workers. Short term might result in a good profit, but long term you lose your workers, and effectively long term affects your profit. So I think it's the issue of long term versus short term where you really have that discrepancy, and that's why I always used to say when we had this debate that for me, in those days when I just come out of investment banking, I said I don't get it, because if you don't look after your customers, you won't have a business. If you don't look after employees, you won't have a business, right? So to me, they're aligned. It's just a matter of the time period that you're looking at. But I think the new dynamic today is social media, because today you can't afford to be too short term, because you could come back and hurt you very quickly.
So that actually the essence is really kind of trying to drive those two spheres increasingly into one footprint rather than being two separate.
And I think, if you're a board, you do have to communicate perhaps to shareholders decisions that may on the face of it look to be affect them short term, but explain the long term implication of why you're doing what you're doing. So again, it comes back to this question of communication is very important.
And one of the question here, which is, do you expect some of the examples that you've mentioned, other companies, and it might be a bit difficult to ask specific companies, but are there kind of examples of best practice? Is there a differentiator from organizations that get some of the things we talked about in terms of culture and resilience and the kind of checklist around ESG? Are there best practices where you've seen that sort of happening within organizations?
I think the best practices that I've seen are generally some of the comments I made before, is that boards that are quite engaged and open, and I think a cultural dashboard is a very good thing in a company if you want to have your finger on the pulse and having the right metrics on that dashboard, because that often can be a red flag to where perhaps you can say, well, hold on, why the customer complaints surged by 30%? We don't understand that. So I think it's a matter of, it's not flawless, but I think having some things that are really, where in fact, your stakeholders could be not happy and you don't know it. It's having indicators where, it could be your regulators as well, right? I've had experience with companies where I've actually had to sort of call the CEO and say, look, you've got a problem in your company, because every time we've seen a pattern that you're always very close to the wind and you're our biggest problem. And the CEO really said, oh no, everything is fine here. But then soon after they had a massive scandal and we weren't surprised. So, culture is really, focusing on culture is a pretty good way of, and a cultural dashboard is quite a useful tool.
Great. Well, I'll finish, if you don't mind, with a quote that somebody mentioned to me when I was talking to them about this from a major organization, which was basically saying now is not the wrong time to be on the wrong side of history. And getting it right is absolutely critical. And I think what you've shared with us today, Greg, has really been some great insights about how you can do that and how you need to be prepared for the future around corporate governance and what needs to happen. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure and honor. And thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you for joining the webcast with the conference board. Goodbye for now. Bye now.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. Ciao.